familiar about all this.
It's oddly amusing that at one point in 1955, there were as many as 4 time machines in existence. One that Marty used to arrive in the first film, one that Marty and Doc used to retrieve the almanac, one that old Biff used to get the almanac for himself, and one that sat buried in a mine for 70 years, just pausing at that moment alone back to the future. Part 2 completely shatters the illusion that time travel is a harmless game. The deeper I dig into the film's behind-the-scenes history, the more unsettled I become by what Back to the Future. Part 2 hides beneath the surface overlapping timelines piled on top of one another to the point of suffocation. Characters pushed aside because of real-world decisions and script choices born out of pressure rather than long-term planning. This is a sequel where Jennifer is literally knocked unconscious because no one knew what to do with her, where Biff becomes a dictator, not because of science fiction, but because of a very familiar kind of power from the 1980s. And here are 15 weird facts you may not have known about. Back to the Future Part 2, 1989. 15. The film was never originally intended to have a sequel. I still remember very clearly the feeling the first time I finished watching Back to the Future, the moment the DeLorean rockets into the sky. Doc turns back and shouts something about Marty's kids, and the screen fades to black. I left my seat with a very clear sensation this adventure wasn't over yet. That feeling was so strong that it almost convinced us the sequel had been planned all along. But the truth was the opposite. For Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, Back to the Future was written as a complete self-contained film. The flying away ending wasn't an invitation for a sequel, but a symbolic image Doc and Marty's lives would continue, just not necessarily on screen. It was a very 1980s cinema kind of ending, where the audience's imagination mattered more than a release schedule. The problem was, Hollywood didn't see it that way. Once the film became a phenomenon, that open ending suddenly turned into a promise that had to be fulfilled. And that's when the filmmakers realized they had trapped themselves with Jennifer. Bob Gale later admitted that if they had known for sure there would be a sequel, they never would have put Jennifer in the DeLorean. They had no plan, no role, no character arc for her in a story full of time paradoxes. So Back to the Future. Part 2 opens with a very mundane decision. Doc knocks Jennifer unconscious with a sleep device, a polite way to remove a character from the board. That's the moment you realise this sequel wasn't born from long-term vision, but from having to patch up an ending that was originally written to be final. 14. When Jennifer changes faces and the movie pretends nothing happened. There are rewatches of Back to the Future Part 2 that make me laugh for a very strange reason. Jennifer looks completely different, and the movie doesn't bother to explain it. The truth behind it is anything but funny. Claudia Wells, who played Jennifer in Part 1, was expected to return. But shortly after the film's release, her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Wells chose to step away from Hollywood to care for her family. The problem was that Part 2 begins at the exact moment Part 1 ends. Jennifer is sitting right there in the DeLorean. The production had no choice but to recast the role, and Elizabeth Shue was chosen. What's interesting is how the film handles it. It does nothing at all. Jennifer simply appears with a new face and the story moves on. That very indifference is what makes it work. Shue brings a more mature, more subdued Jennifer, perfectly suited to the darker, more complex, consequence-heavy tone of Part 2. This Jennifer is no longer just Marty's girlfriend, but an adult dragged into choices far beyond her control. It's a rare example of how changes forced by real life can accidentally serve the story. Back to the Future. Part 2 never says it outright, but it quietly reveals a very human truth. Time doesn't just change people, it changes their faces too. 13. Dark, 1985. Biff Tannen was no accident. When I first watched Back to the Future Part 2 as a kid, I thought Biff's version of Hill Valley was just a bad future, more violent, dirtier, exaggerated, to contrast with the light-hearted world we'd seen before. A very Hollywood kind of exaggeration, but the older I get, the more unsettling it becomes for a different reason it feels familiar. The writers never hid their inspiration. The 1985 version of Biff Tannen was modelled after the public image of a young Donald Trump slicked-back hair buildings bearing his name, conspicuous displays of wealth, and the belief that money places you above the law. Biff gets rich through the sports almanac. Trump rose through real estate. Different paths, same essence. The key point is this: Hill Valley doesn't become hell because of time travel. It becomes hell because a terrible person gains too much money and power. Corruption, violence and decay aren't consequences of sci-fi. They're consequences of removing morality from the equation of success. This is Part 2's boldest turn. A family comedy suddenly speaks bluntly about toxic power. It suggests that the future doesn't need rogue robots to collapse, it just needs enough resources placed in the wrong hands. And that's probably why Biff's timeline is the one that unsettles adult viewers the most when they revisit Back to the Future Part 2. It's no longer a playful what if, it's a warped mirror, one that reflects something uncomfortably real. 12. Hoverboards aren't real, and audiences refuse to accept that. There's no denying that the hoverboard is the most iconic symbol of Back to the Future Part 2. A board that glides over land, skims across water, dodges cars, and saves Marty by inches. Watching it, no one doubted it had to be real. And that was the problem. The filmmakers always assumed audiences would understand that the hoverboard was fictional. But after the movie's release, Universal and Robert Zemeckis were flooded with letters, phone calls, and emails from parents across the United States asking the same question: where can we buy a hoverboard? The confusion grew so intense that Zemeckis had to issue an official statement clarifying that hoverboards did not exist. The behind-the-scenes reality was very down to earth. The hoverboard was created using cables, wooden boards, clever camera angles, and countless retakes. The shots over water relied on transparent glass panels that were later removed in post-production. No magic, just technique. Back to the Future. Part 2 accidentally touched on something fascinating. When cinema becomes convincing enough, it doesn't just tell stories, it shapes expectations of the future. And sometimes, the future never arrives, but the dream lingers for a very long time. 11. A role erased and the lawsuit that changed Hollywood's. Do you remember George McFly's appearances in Back to the Future Part 2? He shows up briefly with very few lines, and the camera angles are oddly awkward, almost as if the film is trying to avoid the character altogether. Only later did I understand that this wasn't an artistic choice. It was a real-world fracture. Crispin Glover's absence wasn't a behind-the-scenes mystery, it was a rupture. After the massive success of the first film, Glover demanded a higher salary and publicly criticised the direction of the sequel. Universal refused to negotiate. They chose to move forward without him. But instead of recasting openly, the production did something dangerous. They reused footage from Part 1, hired another actor as a stand-in, concealed his face with makeup, sunglasses and off-angle shots, all to pretend that Glover was still there. And they did it without permission. Glover sued, and he won. That lawsuit wasn't just a personal victory. It established a crucial legal precedent in Hollywood studios: cannot use an actor's likeness, their appearance, image or presence without consent. After this case, actor contracts changed. The rules of the game changed. A character who seemed minor left an enormous mark behind the scenes. The bitter irony is this George McFly in Part 2 mirrors that very story. A character who once carried emotional weight is pushed to the margins, distorted, appearing like a ghost of himself. Not because the story required it, but because money and power made the decision. 10. A fictional pair of shoes and reality's delayed response. In the 2015 of Back to the Future, Part 2, there's a tiny moment that made everyone say, "Wow!" Marty's shoes tighten their own laces. Just one smooth motion, as if the world had long grown used to it. In 1989, that was pure science fiction. The shoes in the film weren't actually smart. They were built with hidden mechanisms shot across multiple takes and angles to create a seamless illusion. A true cinematic trick. And that seemed like the end of the story, but reality chose to answer slowly. In 2011, Nike released a limited edition Nike Mag. It didn't self-lace, but it nearly perfectly recreated the film's design. Then, in 2016, they went further, real self-lacing shoes. Not replicas, not props. Actual commercial technology directly inspired by Marty McFly. More importantly, part of the proceeds went to the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. The future from the movie looped back and touched the real life of the actor who helped bring it into existence. It's a rare moment that proves a cinematic idea can live for a very long time, waiting patiently until the world is capable of answering it. 9. When Michael J. Fox had to perform 3 roles alone. The first time I watched Back to the Future, Part 2, I just found it fun. Marty has a son, a daughter, an entire future family that's slightly disastrous. But the more I rewatch it, the clearer one thing becomes. None of it works without Michael J. Fox. In Part 2, Fox doesn't just play Marty McFly. He also plays Marty Jr. and Marlene, 2 characters completely different in energy rhythm and body language. No CGI, no digital doubles, just acting motion control cameras and muscle memory. Each scene was filmed multiple times, hours apart. Fox would perform one character, leave the set, change costumes, change mindset, then return to play the other while still maintaining precise eye lines, breathing rhythms and spatial distance, so that when composited, it looked like he was genuinely talking to himself. The hardest role was Marlene. Fox had to learn how to walk, stand, tilt his head, use his hands not to imitate a woman, but to create an entirely different person. Only when the performance could stand on its own did makeup and editing have something solid to sell the illusion. This fits the spirit of the film perfectly. The future looks high-tech, but behind it lies painstaking, extreme manual labour. Back to the Future. Part 2 doesn't rely on machines to replace humans, it forces humans to do more. 8. Back to the Future. Part 2 was filmed back-to-back with Part 3. There's a familiar memory shared by late 1980s audiences, the feeling of waiting. You finished Back to the Future, left hanging in mid-air, and then had to live with the question what happens next for months. That pressure didn't just weigh on audiences, it bore down directly on the filmmakers. Zemeckis once compared a successful franchise to real estate. Once the value rises, you can't pretend you don't see the opportunity to expand. Universal Pictures understood this very well. And instead of making Part 2 and waiting for market reactions, they signed an extremely rare deal for the time filming Part 2 and Part 3 back-to-back. 1 year. 1 continuous production. 2 films with different tone settings and pacing, but the same crew cast and shooting schedule. It was a massive gamble, and also the only way to keep the audience's momentum alive. For Michael J. Fox that year wasn't just a career milestone, it was an intensely compressed year of life. He lost his father and welcomed his newborn son. By day, he was Marty McFly. By night, he was a man undergoing very real personal changes. And all of it in some way was captured on screen. The back-to-back sequel model later became standard The Matrix, Pirates of the Caribbean, Harry Potter. But Back to the Future was among the first to prove that audiences would wait if you kept your promise and delivered the story on time. Part 3 hit theatres just 6 months after Part 2. Not enough time to forget. Not enough space for the emotion to cool. 7. A sequel that almost drifted into the 1960s. Do you ever feel that Back to the Future Part 2 looks both familiar and strange, as if the film is holding up a mirror to itself? What few people know is that the version we see on screen almost never returned to 1955. When Bob Gale began writing the script for Part 2, Robert Zemeckis was busy directing Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Gale was left almost alone to wrestle with the hardest question of all after a film as complete as Back to the Future. Where do you go next? His initial answer was further back into history. The original script still opened in 2015, but instead of returning to 1955, Doc and Marty would be thrown back to 1967, the decade of protest hippies and the Vietnam War. To Gale, it was a logical step. Part 1 dealt with the 1950s, so Part 2 should confront the 1960s. In that version, Lorraine was no longer a nostalgia-soaked mother, but a full-fledged flower child. George McFly wasn't a bumbling writer, but a college professor. Marty was trapped in a highly politicised world. There was even a subplot where he's arrested for not carrying a draft card. This was no longer time travel to fix personal mistakes, but a direct collision with real history. Then Zemeckis returned to pre-production, and together they realised something crucial. Back to the Future is strongest not when it talks about history, but when it deals in paradox. Returning to 1955, a time the audience already knew allowed the film to play a far more dangerous game stacking timelines on top of each other, letting characters walk through the very story that once saved them. 6. Antiques of the future and the video game that never existed. Do you remember the scene where the kids laugh at Marty for not knowing how to play an ancient video game? It's a quick, very natural moment that feels completely believable until you learn the truth. That arcade machine never actually existed. Wild Gunman was a real Nintendo game, but at the time Part 2 was made, it had never existed in the exact arcade cabinet form seen in the film. To shoot the scene, the crew didn't rent a prop. They built the entire machine from scratch, deliberately making it look old, outdated, as if time itself had abandoned it. And here's the interesting part. This wasn't a random choice. Wild Gunman is a cowboy shootout game. The rules are simple: stand still, wait for your opponent to move and react faster. A game about drawing first. In that quiet moment, the film was already planting a subtle seed for Part 3, where Marty would face Buford Mad Dog Tannen in the Old West, and would have to learn not to shoot first. There's a beautiful paradox here. The movie invents an object that never existed in real life, then turns it into an antique of the future. Back to the Future. Part 2 doesn't just play with time inside its story, it plays with pop culture history itself. 5. Pepsi Perfect, when a cinematic joke becomes a real-world event. There's a small moment in Hill Valley 2015 that I've always found fascinating. Marty orders a Pepsi Perfect. Just a drink that looks like it has always existed in the future sleek premium, and slightly too perfect. In 1989, it was just a subtle joke about consumerism in the future. Everything comes with the word perfect attached. Then, time did something strange. On October the 21st, 2015, the exact day Marty arrives in the film, Pepsi released a limited edition Pepsi Perfect. The bottle looked almost identical to the one on screen, rounded, shaped metallic blue label, familiar yet unfamiliar logo. Not an inspired by version, but a literal realization. Fans lined up, collectors bought them out. Pepsi Perfect wasn't just a drink, it was a time souvenir, an object that let people physically touch a moment of cinema once considered pure science fiction. The funny thing is, Pepsi Perfect doesn't taste any better than regular Pepsi. And no one cared. What people were buying wasn't the flavour, it was the feeling of living on Marty McFly's day. 4. When Doc Brown couldn't see the future or the present. Future Doc Brown looks wise, eccentric, and always as if he sees through everything. The paradox is that Christopher Lloyd could barely see anything on set. Doc's metal glasses in 2015 weren't ordinary lenses. They were solid, mirrored reflectors, very futuristic, but they left Lloyd effectively blind. He couldn't see his co-stars. He couldn't see the set. He couldn't see where he was standing. To film safely, Lloyd relied entirely on crew cues, off-camera instructions, and muscle memory. Every step was rehearsed. Every stopping point was marked. The more confident Doc Brown appears on screen, the more tense things were behind the camera. There's a quiet irony here. The character who understands time better than anyone else is the one deprived of sight while performing. And that irony makes Doc Brown feel even more like a scholar living inside his own mind, someone who sees through theory, memory, and belief, rather than through his eyes. 3. Jaws 19, a joke, a name, and Spielberg behind it. Among the many jokes in Hill Valley 2015, Jaws 19 is the most obvious jab, a franchise stretched to the point of absurdity. The shark still bites. The audience still screams. The only difference is that no one is surprised anymore. But look closer, and the joke runs deeper. The director listed on the Jaws 19 poster is Max Spielberg. Not pure fiction, that's Steven Spielberg's real son. Max was born in 1985. By 2015, the film's timeline, he would be exactly 30 years old. The same age Spielberg was when he directed the original Jaws in 1975. A generational loop. A very Spielberg wink. 2. When kids drive the DeLorean with imagination. Pepsi wasn't the only brand riding the Back to the Future wave. Toys R Us joined in too, perfectly tuned to childhood. They sold DeLorean toys large enough for kids to sit inside. The commercials were everything you'd expect, cool, explosive, overflowing with promise. The kid in the ad grins, the car moves, sparks fly, even flames burst out. But who cared? It was a DeLorean. The truth was that the DeLorean in the commercials was mostly illustrated. The real-world version fell far short of the fantasy, but that didn't matter. For a child in 1989, just sitting inside a DeLorean, even one that couldn't fly, was enough to dream. 1. The box office success of a reckless sequel. 1989 was a brutal year at the box office. Batman, Indiana Jones, and The Last Crusade. And right between those two giants, Back to the Future, Part 2 still pulled in $332 million worldwide on a budget of just $40 million. It ranked third globally that year. It was the biggest Thanksgiving release at the time, not a small achievement for a sequel often criticised as messy and not as good as the first. But that messiness was its strength. If Part 1 was comedy and Part 3 was character, then Part 2 was pure action, relentless, risky, never letting the audience breathe. Whatever you think of Back to the Future. Part 2, one thing is undeniable, it dared to try. And for me, no joke, this is my favourite instalment. Back to the Future. Part 2 ends in a very strange way. It doesn't feel complete like Part 1, nor gentle like Part 3. It stops abruptly mid-stride as if the film itself is racing against its own clock. But the older I get, the more I rewatch it, the more I realise that isn't a flaw. It's the nature of a Part 2. Part 2 is a film born of forced decisions of pressure to move forward, of ideas stacked so tightly they almost suffocate. A sequel that was never meant to exist, then stretched into 2 back-to-back films. A story that wants to be fun while being compelled to turn dark. One that sells a dream of the future while accidentally exposing the darker sides of power money and consequence. What about you? Leave a comment about the detail you find most memorable in this film. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you won't miss the next videos.